Good afternoon. This is Dennis Young with Issues in Education. We're speaking from Milwaukee at the 2019 EDspaces Annual Conference. And I'm pleased to have with me Dr. Lennie Scott-Webber with InSync, Educational Research and Design. Thanks for being here.
Thank you for having me.
Tell me a little bit about InSync. What is the services you offer?
Well, I failed at retirement twice, so I decided that I would try to keep marching down the road of trying to be helpful in the knowledge that I offer. So InSync is about supporting and developing research platforms and agendas and instruments to support architecture and education, because my doctorate is in environment behavior psychology. So I wanted to understand, how does the built environment impact particularly student learning and student engagement as a measurable factor? And so for the last 20 plus years, I've been a research academic at a couple of different universities. I was a former director of education environments and the research project for Steelcase Education, and then I've recently been the consulting director for, or the lead researcher for DLR Group and their K-12 division. So we've developed a couple of different instruments for student engagement and teacher engagement. And I think the emphasis for me is, how do you not only develop research and sort of prove, if you will, that design does matter, that it impacts not only the way we live and breathe in these different built spaces, but that we actually get an opportunity to be engaged in our learning process. But then how do we help the design community begin to embed this knowledge and the data that looks very foreign at times in an academic speak into a language that they can actually use in practice? And so then it becomes this reciprocal cycle of gathering the information, putting it into some kind of an envelope, and then sharing it back so that they can then support the design community that they're working for, the educators, the school districts, ultimately the students and their learning process. So that's what I do.
Well, you know, the traditional design process is where the designer sits down with, in essence, the client and develops a program of space needs.
Right.
And there's a lot of clarity. They know exactly what they want, and certainly over the budget most of the time, but they're pretty clear on what they're looking for. With today's change in pedagogy, different academic pathways, new thoughts about exit outcomes, they're not clear anymore on what these spaces need to be.
And I would argue that the educator, the facility planner might have been, but I would argue that the educator really has never really understood how space works and can work for them as another tool. So you're absolutely right. The format has changed, and I think we have to, early on in the visioning process, you need to have multiple constituents at the table. The educators, the students, maybe even some of the parents that represent the community, the interiors folks, the researchers, and the architects, and the community client, if you will, to really sort of envision this, because everything that happens there now impacts the entire community. It's not just about my child going to school. It's about how might we sustain this thinking, this new vision that we're creating, that's going to impact hopefully every child, and it's going to impact the teachers. I always used to say, you know, the educational classroom is where I go to work every day. You know, the children are going to go through me on their journey, but I'm going to be here, and so this is my workplace. And if it looks like crap, I probably don't want to show up. You know, or if I don't have my tools and they're not working for me, or you come in the summer and install a new tool and you never give me any orientation to it, it'll probably sit there because they don't know how to use it. So this, I think this segmented way of designing also needs a new paradigm. I think it needs to shift to be more holistic all the way through the process, so that you not only have buy-in, but you get the wisdom from these different parties as as the architect begins to become more of the maestro and lead all of the different instruments in the orchestra pit, if you will.
Yeah.
As a metaphor.
Yeah, well, that's a good way to explain it.
Yeah.
You know, what I find is, and this is a few years back, you know, when STEM first came to the horizon, that everyone was excited about what a STEM room would be, and nobody knew what it was. And we're now moved past that. We're into other spaces, you know, throughout the school, and teachers really don't have a clear vision of how they're going to teach, how they're going to be measured, and, you know, going from content-based to innovation.
Exactly. And I think K-12 is one planet of education.
Yeah.
Higher education is another planet of education. And very different ethos, very different perspective. But I would also say that when you are thinking about these kinds of places, if you don't think systemically, you're still going to have bells and cells. And if you've only got 50 minutes or 45 minutes to do something with students, you're not even going to take them out the door. So those breakout spaces that you've so beautifully designed in a year are going to become storage spaces. In 2 years they're going to become another indoor classroom, because there isn't this systemic thinking about how long does it take me to really learn something. You know, we've had the luxury of growing up in studios, which is very much about problem-based, project-based learning, and a 4-hour to 6-hour time frame. You can get into something, you can get in the flow of your own learning. We have to stop the 50-minute cycle. It's just still in the factory model. And so it's systemic, it's across the whole thinking. So it's not just about, have you got a maker space? I think every learning space should be a learning studio. So the making happens. Because if I don't know what I'm trying to do with this space, it's going to sit empty.
That's right.
And all that money that went to that equipment, unless you're bringing in an expert from the outside that knows how to do this widget or whatever's in there, you won't be able to have that cross-pollination. You won't be able to have that opportunity. And you won't even be able to use the breakout space that might be right outside that classroom if you don't get rid of that time frame. It's the blocks that are really, I think, the biggest impediment to innovation in education, because it's systemic.
Well, one of the things that I see in, say, Architectural Record, other magazines, as I look what's going on around the country, some very impressive, and others, you're thinking, I think the designer had too heavy of a voice in that design. It wasn't listening to other people.
I think I'm going to become an architectural critic in my next
failure. For you.
In my next failure, because when I look at those pictures are all what I call big A. All of the breakout spaces, and isn't it nice moving through the building? There's not one formal learning place in a picture, not one. What does that say? That the formal learning place isn't important? Or does it also say that architecture isn't encompassing the full interiors perspective, which means that you could actually go into that place and not just call us FF&E, or I'm going to call architects SGS, steel, glass, and screws, instead of architects, because it puts a whole 4 to 5 years of education, which is very different than architecture, very different than engineering, into a bucket that makes no sense. So if you're looking at, again, holistically across the spectrum of talent in this orchestra pit, you can't do this music without the flautist, or you can't do this music without the drummer, and their expertise and trust that they're going to be there with all of their knowledge. And I think that's the paradigm that I'm hoping that we begin to see the change, so that when you build a project, which is so precious in education, to a community, that it has this robust thinking, this robust feeling, this robust connection between research and people and place, and what that means for when we lock the door and say, it's yours. What is that legacy? Now, how does that legacy get sustained? And I think that's the shift in mindset that has to happen for design and for the building of educational places.
How do you deal with the situation where you went through the collaborative process. You had everybody's voices at the table. And after they move in, everybody's just happy as can be. This is exactly what we envisioned, what we're looking for. And about 3 or 4 years later, the violinist or the drummer leaves and a new one comes in. And I go, I can't believe anybody would have thought about doing it this way.
I think that's about that whole thinking of stewardship.
Okay.
When you think of, we had a presentation from Crow Island the other day, and that's an iconic symbol, 80 years in the making, but that's that paradigm shift where the whole community realized that they were going to have to be docents of why this was done here. It was an oral tradition as well that was passed on for the value, for the decisions that were made, so that understanding grows and gets embedded over time. And whenever you're generating new vision for any kind of place, I think, again, if it's not holistic and the entire populace doesn't have buy-in, and particularly the educators, I would say K-12 in particular, because every 2 to 3 years, somebody changes in their realm, and it's horrendous.
Yes.
I can't even imagine how they cope with all that nonsense. And so as the architects coming in, as the maestros of this orchestra, I think it's really critical that you recognize that. And you say, okay, do you want to build a legacy for this? Because if we do, here are the pieces and the parts that we have to go through. And maybe it means more money here, or maybe it means less there. But it means that as a community, we know what that vision is. We know the steps it's going to take to have legacy building. And it's really about sustaining and having the kids or the students and the faculty and the parents all have a not only value it, but have a voice in it.
Yeah, they have a stake.
And they have a stake in it, and they know that they're going to have to be participatory. It's not just passive. It's, we're moving to active learning and active collaboration. It's all got to be active. It's all got to be active.
Well, when we were talking before the cameras, you were talking about studying and researching behaviors.
Yes.
Fascinating area.
Yeah.
Just very
I'm a
fascinating.
social anthropologist.
Oh, that's
Basically
really,
what I do.
that's really interesting.
Well, I also develop, surveys and that sort of thing. So what we say we do, what we think we do, we put on paper. But what we actually do is sometimes a very different story.
Right.
So I think both layers of research are really important. This one you can do at scale, because you can do a lot. The latest survey with Student Engagement Index for DLR Group, we have now over 7,000 students and almost 800 faculty. It's no longer a small study.
Right.
Grades 6 to 12. But when you do a research case study, you're on site. You really are that anthropologist, and you're, so it's much more time intensive. But I think the information gained and the knowledge gained, it really helps you balance. Okay, if this is what we're seeing here, and this is what might be in that mix. How might we connect those two pieces of data and knowledge building together to really maybe make it even better.
When the listening audience observes our conversation, what are the 2 or 3 things that you could really help them with, and they should contact you on?
Oh my.
I'm trying to keep it to 3. So.
I think I try to be a voice for the educator and for other disciplines besides architecture that have a knowledge base that I think in today's world of designing for education is critical to bring to the table. And so I try to be that voice. I try to provide, share. I'm a teacher, so I share a lot of information, and they can see that on my website. But it's really about, I think, being much more intentional about the process and how that, once the building's done, you're gone. But that impact lives its legacy for the next 50, 100 years. What does that mean now? What does it mean now? And how might we me generate that new process, and who are the people that we should connect with.
Outstanding. It's been really interesting talking to you.
Well, thank
We could
you.
talk all afternoon
I know,
on
we
this.
could have fun on this.
But
Thank you
very
so
nice
much for
meeting
the
you.
opportunity.
Please contact
Thank you.
Dr. Lennie Scott-Webber. A lot of resource and knowledge, and I just think it's wonderful. This is a perfect time to share your knowledge as schools trying to transform themselves from kind of knowledge and content-based to something that's more innovative and creative and changing that whole paradigm.
Well, thanks. I've been beating the drum for about 20 plus years, and maybe the door's
Maybe
starting to
someone's
open
listening to
now. Who knows?
Thank you
Thanks
so
so
much.
much.
See
Appreciate
ya.
the
Bye
opportunity.
now.
Bye.